Welcome to our channel. Join us on this journey into the depths of the soul, because this path belongs to all of us. Today I will tell you about Jeff Olsen's near-death experience, which occurred after a tragic car accident that he caused. In this accident, Jeff lost his wife and baby, but he and his 7-year-old son survived. His near-death experience played a crucial role in helping him overcome the deep guilt and sorrow that weighed on him like a nightmare after the tragedy. Jeff grew up in the United States in a divorced family and was raised by his mother. He had 2 siblings, and his mother was a devout Christian. During his university years, he met a young woman, fell in love, and got married. His wife was a high school teacher, and Jeff worked as a marketer. Soon they had a son and named him Spencer. Everything was going well, and they were very happy. His wife wanted to have another child, but they faced some difficulties, and only after 6 years did they have their second child, a baby boy named Griffin. It was Easter weekend. They had visited his wife's family and had a wonderful weekend together. Then it was time to return home because Jeff had to go to work. They had a 4 to 5 hour drive ahead of them. Everyone got into the car. Just as Jeff started the engine, his wife said, "Wait a minute, I want to say goodbye to my parents." Jeff thought, but we already said our goodbyes. His wife went back, hugged, and kissed her parents one last time. Then she got into the car, and they set off. Jeff set the car's speed to the maximum legal limit. He was in a hurry to get back to the office and to work. As he was driving, he was also thinking about everything he had to do when he got there. His wife had fastened her seatbelt, reclined her seat, and was dozing off while holding Jeff's hand. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Their youngest son, Griffin, who had just started walking and talking, was sitting in his car seat. What a miracle, he thought. After all, they had been told they wouldn't be able to have children, and yet here he was. His 7-year-old son, Spencer, was playing with his small toys. Jeff looked at his wife again and thought, "How lucky I am." His heart filled with gratitude. An hour later, everything changed. The wind on the road was strong, and he had been driving for a long time without taking a break. Maybe for a minute, maybe just a few seconds, he dozed off. Suddenly, the car veered to the right. He woke up and, in a panic, made a sharp maneuver to the left to correct it. But he lost control. The car began rolling over. It must have flipped 6 or 8 times. For most of it, he was unconscious. He didn't remember the motion. But when the car finally came to a stop, he was fully awake. The first thing he noticed was his 7-year-old son, Spencer, sobbing hysterically in the back seat. Jeff thought, he must be okay. He's crying, he's alive. He tried to reach him, but he couldn't move. He couldn't tell if he was pinned to the seat or trapped on the ground. The pain was excruciating, and he was struggling to breathe. He wasn't even aware of his injuries, but in reality both of his legs were crushed and shattered. His back was injured, his ribs were broken, and his lungs had collapsed. His right arm was nearly severed. The seatbelt had cut into his abdomen, severely damaging his internal organs. But none of that mattered to him. His son was crying, and he wanted to get to him. Then suddenly he realized no one else was crying. The car was silent. In that moment, he understood. His wife and baby were gone. Since she had reclined her seatbelt hadn't been able to protect her properly, and she had suffered a fatal head injury. His baby's car seat had shattered, and the child had been ejected from the vehicle. Jeff couldn't see him, but he knew. His baby was gone. A crushing wave of guilt and regret overwhelmed him. He wished he could take back those 5 seconds. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He tried to speak to his crying son. He knew he was about to lose consciousness. "Everything is going to be okay," he told him. Then he thought, what a terrible lie. Half of his family was gone. Nothing would ever be the same again. As these thoughts consumed him, suddenly, a light surrounded him. It wrapped around him like a warm blanket, and an immense sense of peace washed over him. He was rising. He could breathe again. The pain was gone. Then, out of nowhere, his wife appeared beside him. She looked more radiant and beautiful than he had ever seen her. She had no injuries. She was whole, glowing, magnificent. But she was also upset and urgent. Jeff, you have to go back. You have to go back. You can't be here," she said. He thought of his son sobbing in the back seat. He had to make a choice. The place he was in felt so real, just as real as the physical world. He could see, hear, smell, and even taste, just like in life. In fact, from that perspective, that place felt like reality, while his earthly life seemed like a foggy dream. But he knew he couldn't leave his son orphaned. He had to go back. He said goodbye to his wife. And the moment he decided to return, he found himself wandering inside a hospital. Time had no meaning. He had no idea how long it had been. But in reality, people had arrived at the crash site almost immediately. One of the first people to arrive at the crash site was a doctor who provided emergency medical assistance. His son was physically okay, bruised and shaken but without any serious injuries. Emotionally, however, he was devastated. He believed he had lost his entire family. Due to the severity of Jeff's injuries, he was airlifted to the nearest city hospital. But Jeff was unaware of all this. Instead, he found himself wandering through a hospital. He looked at nurses, doctors, patients, and their families. Yet, incredibly, he knew every single one of them. They were strangers, and yet, when he looked at them, he knew them. He understood their love, their hatred, their choices, their motivations, their pain, as if they were his own. He saw a nurse and suddenly knew that she had been abused as a child. And he didn't just know it, he felt it, as if it had happened to him. But now, looking at her, he thought, wow, look at everything she has overcome. Now she's healing others. He felt a deep compassion for her. It didn't matter who they were or what they had done. He felt an overwhelming connection and love for everyone. Then, a verse from the Bible came to his mind, something Jesus had said. "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Wow, he thought, that's what Jesus meant. I am them, and they are me. He was in awe of this experience, until he saw a man lying on a hospital stretcher. Unlike everyone else, he felt nothing for this person. No connection, no understanding, no emotions. It struck him as strange. So he moved closer. And then he realized. The man on the stretcher was him. It was his own body. The sight was heartbreaking. His body was completely wrecked, but he had to return. He thought about how he could re-enter his body. And the moment he intended it, he was back inside. That was all it took. Intention. But the instant he returned, the weight of everything crashed down on him. Guilt, regret, pain, trauma. He spent nearly 6 months in the hospital. One of his legs was amputated above the knee. Since his lungs had collapsed, he had to breathe through a tube inserted into his throat. His legs and one of his arms were completely immobile. His other arm was tied to the bed because he kept trying to remove the medical equipment attached to him. Throughout those 6 months, he drifted between being inside his body and outside of it. It felt like taking small breaks because being in his body was unbearable. He was in constant communication with his wife. She kept telling him what she wanted for the funeral service. The details were small, insignificant, but she talked about them constantly. By then, he was out of intensive care. He was only a few weeks away from going home. He could finally sleep on his side. That night, he fell asleep again, wrapped in guilt, sorrow, and pain. And then, the light returned. Just like during the crash, it wrapped around him like a warm blanket. And again, a deep sense of peace washed over him. He felt himself rising. Then, like mist dissolving into the air, the light faded. And suddenly, he found himself in an incredibly beautiful place. He was running. He could feel every muscle in his legs moving. He was running with pure joy. The first thought that crossed his mind was, "It feels so good to be home. I'm home." People could call it heaven or the afterlife, but to him, this place simply felt like home. And he was so happy to be there. Then he received a message. It wasn't spoken. It was more like an instant knowing. He hadn't come here to stay. But I want to stay, he thought. Then, in the distance, he saw a corridor. Instinctively, he knew he had to walk toward it, so he did. At the end of the corridor, he saw a cradle, just like the one his baby used to sleep in. He ran to it and looked inside. His son, Griffin, was there. He was sleeping peacefully, just as Jeff had seen him in the rearview mirror before the crash. He was there, and he was perfectly fine. Jeff picked him up. He could feel his warm little body. He's okay, he thought. He could see him breathing. Yes, he whispered. He's completely okay. Because that was the one thing he had kept wondering. He breathed in the scent of his baby's hair. Griffin was whole, safe, healthy. And Jeff started to cry. For months he had longed for this moment. Then, behind him, he felt a powerful presence, a cosmic, vast, wise energy. A being so powerful that Jeff thought, this must be God. And suddenly, he was afraid. Because he was in the presence of God, and he was guilty. His own actions had caused his son's death. He had crashed the car. He was responsible for everything. He hoped for forgiveness, but his guilt ran too deep, and then he felt this presence wrap its arms around him and his son. And a message, clear, undeniable, flowed into him. There is nothing to forgive. Everything is pure. Everything is in divine order. Everything is exactly as it should be. All his fears, his failures, his guilt, his self-judgment vanished in the overwhelming love pouring from this being. Jeff says there are no words to describe this love. And in that moment, he saw his life differently. He saw his childhood. He saw how his parents' divorce had left him feeling insecure. He saw his relationships with his siblings and everything they had been through. Even the mistakes were embraced with love. The message was clear. There are no mistakes. Everything is in perfect order. Then he remembered his hospital experience, when he had felt one with everyone around him. And he realized, if I am perfect, then everyone else is perfect too. Because we are all one. We are the same. We all belong to the same place. And then he was given 3 choices. He could spend the rest of his life angry at himself for losing his family. He could spend the rest of his life angry at God for taking them. Or he could surrender his son back to God, back to the universe. And it was critical that he made this choice with his own free will. He made his choice. He kissed his baby. And with all the love, peace, and beauty in that moment, he gave him back to God. He let go. And then he woke up in his hospital bed. But there is another fascinating, lesser-known part of Jeff's story. At the hospital, there was a trauma doctor named Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. On the day of the crash, while the doctors were trying to save Jeff, Dr. O'Driscoll saw something unusual. He saw Jeff's deceased wife. She was there in the trauma room. She was watching the doctor's work, filled with love and gratitude for their efforts to save her husband. Dr. O'Driscoll was not new to this. For many years, he had been able to see those who had passed away. He even kept a journal of his experiences. The nurses knew about his gift. So, as Jeff's condition improved, the doctor waited. And just before Jeff was discharged, Dr. O'Driscoll visited him, bringing along a nurse. He wanted to share what he had seen, believing that this knowledge might bring Jeff some comfort. Jeff was shocked, and for the first time, he shared his own near-death experience with the doctor. To this day, the two remain close friends. Jeff says, "This experience changed me. But I want to be clear, it wasn't easy. I didn't just have these incredible experiences and suddenly heal. For nearly 10 years, I was completely broken." Coming home to his son was the hardest thing. He kept thinking, how am I going to do this? He remembers the day he arrived. His 7-year-old son, Spencer, was watching from the window as Jeff's brothers lifted him out of the car and placed him in a wheelchair. Then, Spencer ran outside. He threw himself into Jeff's arms, hugging him tightly. And in that moment, Jeff had a realization. Sitting in a wheelchair, holding my living son in this world, was no less divine than holding my deceased son in the next. Suddenly, heaven was right there, because there are moments in life, tiny, fleeting moments, that are sacred, as if something opens, and your heart just knows. So Jeff had to rebuild his life. And he did. But here's the key. Even after everything, even after experiencing something so profound, he was still searching for peace and joy. Where could I find it, he wondered. Could my job give it to me? Could the feeling of being wanted, loved, or needed bring me peace? But the real question was, where is all that love I felt in my near-death experience? Where can I find it? And finally, instead of looking outward, he turned inward, and that's when he realized everything he was searching for, he would find only when he loved himself unconditionally. And when that happened, that's when the healing began. We live in fear. We've been conditioned to fear judgment, to fear religion, even to fear our own parents. From a young age, we are told, "You're a bad child. You don't deserve this. You can't have that. You must earn it. You are not enough." But the truth is, we are worthy. We are so worthy. And the world is so beautiful. There are no mistakes. Everything is happening in divine order. And if I am perfect, then everyone is perfect, because we are all one, because we are all exactly where we are meant to be. It's like stepping into a river. If you fight the current, you'll struggle. No matter how hard you swim, you'll sink. But if you surrender, if you let go, the current will carry you exactly where you are meant to be. Because in the universe, there are no mistakes. Everything is exactly as it should be. And we are exactly where we are meant to be.